You're listening to Straight from the Pulpit. Here you will find sermons taken directly from the pulpit of Shenandoah Baptist Church in Verona, Virginia. We preach Christ, study the Word of God, and help the Christian grow spiritually by applying God's Word to their lives. For more information or to read the pastor's blog, go to sbcverona.com. That is sbcverona.com. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 12, still in David's life, because there's a whole lot to learn from him. And if God didn't think so, then, well, why did he give us so much information about him to learn from? We have a lot to learn here from David, specifically now talking about accepting correction. Maybe this is just me. Maybe this is a guy thing, or maybe this is everybody. Feel free to make me feel like I'm alone on this one, though, if you want to. But it's hard to accept correction. Yeah? Anybody with me on that one? Okay, me and Eric, we've struggled to accept correction. And Linda, good. So I'm not the only person here this morning. Man, I tell you what, my pride will not let me easily accept that I'm wrong. And if you've ever been married, you have gone through the experience of being wrong. If you've ever been a husband, you've gone through the experience of being wrong, right? More times than you are willing to admit. More times than you would even recognize. Isn't that true too? And when we are wrong, and I don't just mean wrong about, directions, how to go to this place or how to put the kid's bike together or something like that. I don't mean that kind of wrong, or how much sugar goes in the sweet tea. I don't mean that kind of wrong either. I mean, our spirit, our attitude, the things we say or do being right or wrong, morally. Sometimes we may say and do things that to us we never intended necessarily to be harmful or hurtful, but nevertheless that's not how it came out or was received. And while we feel like we may have never wronged anybody, because I didn't have a mean intention in my words, I wasn't trying to attack or accuse, nevertheless, it caused a problem. How do I swallow that I'm wrong? Now, those are maybe some gray areas, but there's a whole lot of black and white areas where we are clearly wrong. We open up our mouths in anger or in frustration and say something we knew before it came out of our mouths we should have just kept it shut, because all that's going to do is make the problem worse. There's no help whatsoever in those words. And right before we said it, we knew we shouldn't have said it, but our anger and frustration was up, and so we just let her fly and figured we'd just pick up the pieces afterwards. Well, the problem with that is sometimes pieces don't glue back together quite as nicely as they were the first time, and it leaves scars. I remember the first time I got a little model airplane, and it was a cheapo, electric one, and I was so desperate to fly this thing. I got it at Christmas, and one of the worst things you can do to a kid is give them a summer toy at Christmas. It's like, well, thanks, Mom and Dad, for this thing that I can't use for 6 months. That's horrible. And, sometimes I'll buy something for one of the kids, and Rachel's like, nope, that'll be Christmas. Like, Christmas? They won't be able to use it at Christmas. They'll have to wait 4 months before they can use it. That's just cruel. But anyways, my opinion doesn't matter. And I remember flying that remote control airplane, and within 5 seconds I had it in a tree. 5 seconds it was in a tree. What do I do with it now? How do I get it down out of the tree? I can't climb the tree. It wasn't a thick enough tree for me to be able to fly in. I couldn't reach it. And I had to wait. Next day, it had blown down out of the tree, and I took it up and I started flying it again. Second time I flew the thing, it crashed into a tree again, and the wing broke. Well, that wing was never right again. Let's just put it that way. That wing never operated quite right again, no matter how much duct tape I put on it. Now, I understand duct tape's not the most aerodynamic substance to put when you have a whole load of duct tape right here and none on the rest of the wing. It changes the... Anyways, it didn't glue back together the right way. It was never going to operate right again. Sometimes we think, I'm just going to let her fly. I'm just going to say the words I want to say, and I'll try to pick up the pieces later. It doesn't always work out quite that well. It leaves scars. I would rather get in trouble for not having said something than something I did say. And I do. I get in trouble for not saying things. I get in trouble for keeping my... I know what you're thinking. You know what? I'll be in trouble for what I didn't say. That's fine. There's no winning, you know? But we just can't let her fly. Now, here comes the tough part. The tough part, you know, it's swallowing those words. That's hard. It's hard to swallow the temptation and to not allow yourself to act. That's hard. But you know what's even harder? Accepting responsibility for your words and actions. That's harder. You know what's even harder than that? Accepting consequences for your words and actions. And I've said many times before, you can't choose your consequences. You don't get to say, okay, well, I'm going to do this thing so long as that is my consequence and that's it. And it only happens once. I think it's worth sinning if that's my only consequence. And we can't choose what the consequences are. And we can't possibly know what the consequences are going to be. Or even how long they're going to last. Or how many of them they're going to be. I mean, how many people it's going to affect and in what way. And we can't choose those things. Now, I don't want you to live in necessarily fear of the consequences per se. And the great thing about that is if we live in fear of disappointing God, then we can avoid a whole lot of sin and we'll never have to fear the consequences. If we fear disappointing God, we don't have to fear the consequences. David, like we studied the last 2 or 3 weeks, David made some poor choices here. He wasn't where he was supposed to be. He wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing. His eyes set upon something he was never supposed to see to begin with. And then, on top of that, the temptation came and he kept his eyes on the thing he was not supposed to. If not physically, the eyes of his mind continued to remain there. He did not interrupt the process of temptation to sin to destruction. He did not interrupt it. He did not seek help there. He just continued to allow it to run its course, thinking that he could keep it under control. But he did not keep it under control. It very quickly spun out of control. And this was another one of those cases where David thought, I'm just going to let it fly and then pick up the pieces later. It won't be so bad. I can just glue it back together. There was no gluing this one back together, was there? This was good and broken. He had gotten another man's wife pregnant. He had to kill that man so that the truth about what he had done didn't come out. I mean, goodness. There was no gluing that one back together. It was good and broken. There was no pretending that had never happened. It had happened. There were consequences. But David had still not come to terms with that. He was still living life as if none of that had happened. Pretending in his day-to-day life with the people around him, and even pretending before God, none of it had ever happened. I'm not talking about, what happens after we get forgiveness. After we get forgiveness, we've confessed it before God, we've sought forgiveness, He promises to forgive, and then, now that sin has been forgiven and separated from us, we go on. I'm not talking about that. He had not confessed it. He was pretending like it had never happened at all. I'm going to continue on with my same level of respect. I'm going to continue on just like it had never happened. But that doesn't work. Several months had passed after David marries Bathsheba after the death of her husband. Months where they both tried to pretend that everything was all right. What was David's life like during this time, do you think? Do you think it was pleasant? Do you think he was a pleasant person to be around during this point in his life? Have you been around people that are living in sin? Let me ask it this way. Have you been around Christians that are living in a backslidden state? Not pleasant all the time, are they? None of us are, frankly. I've met you all. We're not all pleasant at all times, right? I'm not all pleasant all the time. And you don't have to be around me long to figure that out. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when a Christian is living in sin, trying to ignore it. There is this constant battle and conflict raging inside them. And you may never really get a peek of it until they get stirred up about something. And when everything's gone fine, when everything is just nice and smooth, they can keep the battle below the surface. But when something doesn't go their way, when they're not feeling well, and there's a little bit more turmoil, you start to see what's beneath the surface come out. You start to see a little bit of the battle that they are going through. Hey, if that's us this morning, today's the day to get it dealt with. Today's the day to humbly seek forgiveness for that sin, to recognize it as what it is, to seek forgiveness. Get help if you need it, but seek forgiveness. Reconcile yourself to God and to someone else, even if you've transgressed against them. And then forsake it. Forsake that sin. Turn your back on it and walk away. Not that it's never going to tempt you again, because it will. And it may continue to do so for years and years. But you turn your back on that sin because you're choosing something else. Not because it no longer appeals to you, because it still does. You can't just flip a switch and suddenly don't want alcohol anymore if you've been drinking it your whole life, or suddenly not want nicotine anymore if you've been smoking your whole life. You can't just flip a switch. Some people can. Some people, their chemistry or their biology, enables them to be able to do that. But most people aren't like that. When I say forsake it, I don't mean that it never has any pull on you anymore. I mean that you have turned and chosen something else instead. If that's us this morning, let today be that day. Inwardly, what was David like? He was anguished. He knew how badly he had wronged. He knew what it had cost him. He never anticipated how bad it was going to get, though. He knew he had lost fellowship with God, and he was not at all prepared to get things right. Listen to how David himself describes his own personal life during this time. Good morning. Psalm 32, verse 3. Listen to this. Psalm 32, verses 3 and 4. David is describing the inward turmoil he was going through. He says, when I kept silence, and here he's not talking about when I just chose not to talk to anybody. When I kept silence before God, when I ignored my sin and refused to get it right, he says, when I kept silence, my bones waxed old through my roaring all the day long. You ever found yourself there? When I kept silence, my bones waxed old through my roaring all the day long. For day and night, thy hand, God's hand, was heavy upon me. My moisture is turned into the drought of summer. Selah. And we could preach on those verses alone for a little while if we wanted to. He says, for day and night thy hand was heavy upon me. The hand of God. Have you ever felt the hand of God weighing upon you? Because of a poor decision or some transgression or sin that was that you've committed? Something that you were in the midst of committing. And day and night it continued to... I haven't gotten there yet. I'm moving slowly here. Day and night, it just continued to weigh heavily upon you. And again, it's like there's this constant battle going on underneath the surface, and it shows itself once in a while. He said, my moisture is turned into the drought of summer. What does that mean? Does this mean that his body, dried up and he was going through rough times in that way? No. Did God withhold the rain? No. Did God take away all of his money? No. Did God burn down his house? No. Did God take away the health of his family? Children died? No. It wasn't that God took away all those things, but this is what he means. my blessings, I couldn't even see them. It was like a drought to me. Here I was in the midst of moisture, in the midst of great blessing and success, but because of my sin in my life, I still felt like I was in the midst of a drought. Have you ever been there? Because of the sin in your life, you couldn't recognize all of the ways God had and was blessing you. It was just, your sin was just sucking it all out of you. You couldn't appreciate it, you couldn't enjoy it, you just felt dried up and shriveled. You just wanted to hide. You just wanted to be gone. Why? Was it because everything was going against you? Was it because the enemy was outside your house shooting bullets into your house? Was it because your body was falling apart? Was it because your money had been stolen from you and your house was burning down? I mean, Job had all of those things happening to him, except for the bullets part. Job had all of that stuff happening to him, and yet Job had a good spirit about it. And yet a Christian who has none of those things happening to them can't help but see dirt and dust. Can't help but be depressed despite all the blessings. This is what David's talking about when he says, my moisture is turned into the drought of summer. God didn't take the moisture away. The sin did. Because of his sin and refusal to repent, David lost time. I don't mean that his life was shortened per se. Very well may have been, I don't know. We know that sin does have those kinds of consequences upon us, and of course we make bad choices which can shorten our lives in other ways too, but what I mean is that interval of time between when he sinned and refused to get it right is time lost. Oh, you may have earned money during that time. You may have gone on vacations. You may have relaxed on the couch, watched TV. You may have had children. You may have any number of good things may have occurred during that interval of time. But when we compare it to eternity, that time was lost. Because you have nothing of eternal or spiritual value in that interval of time. It's gone. You can't go back and get it again. Now, I don't want us to sit here and bemoan or mourn lost time. Okay, that's behind us now. And if you have been saved, and if you are standing right before God and you've gotten forgiveness of yesterday's sins and the day before that sins, and you stand right and pure before God, not because you're perfect, but because you've gotten forgiveness of sins. And you're trying to live right today. And tomorrow you'll ask forgiveness of the sins you committed today, even while trying to live right. But you continue that process. We can't change yesterday, but we can change tomorrow. And we can set in store from this day forward things for eternity. David had been in Jerusalem when he wasn't supposed to be. He was supposed to be out fighting and winning on the battlefield. Now he's running from God when he should have been running for God. Think about that one too. Running from God, trying to hide from Him, trying to not let your sins catch up to you, instead of running for God and progressing and succeeding and receiving the Lord's blessings and accomplishing His work. He was sinking when he could have been climbing. He was off track, moving in the wrong direction. Think about the military campaign. We're going to read here in chapter 12 in just a bit. David was supposed to be out there at the battle. Do you know what was going on at that battle? It was a siege, so it wasn't a single battle. It was a whole series of battles that lasted months or even years. But you know what was going on? It was a stalemate. We see a correlation between David's spiritual progress and the nation's progress, even when it came to the war itself. It wasn't going anywhere. spinning its wheels, much like David. So we come back to chastening. Nobody likes chastening, but God will sometimes bring people into our lives to correct us. And while at the time they may not be our favorite people in the world, they are our best friends in the world. You see, your best friend doesn't just tell you what you want to hear. Your best friend will tell you things that offend you sometimes. And the only reason it offends you is because you're in the flesh. And what they're telling you is in the spirit. And it offended your flesh. Not that it was biblically wrong or spiritually wrong, it was just against you, and you didn't like it. But sometimes we need to hear those things. I mean, we always need to hear those things, but sometimes it's hard. We look first here, and I'm not going to be able to get very far into it, at number 1, an erring heart. An erring heart. Let's read from 2 Samuel 12, and we'll read verses 1 through 7. It says, "And the Lord sent Nathan unto David, and he came unto him and said unto him, There were 2 men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing, save one little ewe lamb, which he had brought and nourished up, and it grew up together with him and with his children. It did eat of his own meat, and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was unto him as a daughter. And there came a traveler unto the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock, and of his own herd, to dress, for the wayfaring man was come unto him, but took the poor man's lamb, and dressed it for the man that was come to him. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man." Here you see a little piece. You know, that battle that's going on beneath the surface. It's about to come up above the surface here in David. David hears the story and flies into a rage. And he said to Nathan, "As the Lord liveth, that man that hath done this thing shall surely die." Whoa, well, that's kind of harsh. Okay, I get it, that this lamb was this man's prized possession, and he loved that lamb like he loved a daughter, but I mean, it is a lamb, And typically in the Bible, if you steal somebody else's animal, you repay them, fourfold, fivefold, tenfold. You repay back what you took. It's not like you kill a person here. But you see the extent of David's rage. He's murderous again. How could somebody possibly do that? Can you imagine getting that angry at somebody who had done this, and yet failing to notice what you had done was far worse? But we're good at that, aren't we? We're good at getting angry about the mote in somebody else's eye, while ignoring the beam that is in our own eye. In fact, it's really that beam which makes us so angry at the mote, isn't it? At the splinter that's in somebody else's eye. We continue on. His anger was kindled. He said he'll die, verse 6. "And he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David," we know this phrase, right? "Thou art the man." It was you, David. You're the one that did it. Now, I am curious at the thought process that David now goes through. I don't know if he's sitting on his throne when Nathan comes before him. It's probable. Or he's sitting down at the table to eat. But here Nathan comes and he says, "You're the man." If David's angry, if he's got his blood up in a stir, I mean, he might have stood up from his throne. That man's got to die. He stands up. And he's going to pay back fourfold for the thing that he did. And Nathan says, "It was you, David. You're the man." I can imagine all of that fury and strength that just made David stand up in anger and pound his fist down on whatever he could find to pound it on, suddenly left him. Weakened. Falls back into his throne seat again. Falls back into his chair. And the process that goes through his mind here, what? I didn't. Oh. Does Nathan know? Did God tell him? This must have been I don't know how many seconds this awkward pause lasted as David sat there and processed what had just happened. And then he had a decision to make. And then I'm going to stop because we're running out of time. He had a decision to make. I can either get angry and bitter at God and the man of God for pointing out my sin, or I can get right. You know what he did. Pretend you don't, so that we can leave it a cliffhanger, all right? Come back next Sunday school morning and find out which decision David made.
You have been listening to Straight from the Pulpit podcast from the pulpit of Shenandoah Baptist Church in Verona, Virginia. Be sure to follow this podcast and share this sermon with a friend. And if you're listening on Spotify, please leave us a 5-star review. See you next time.